And then there's also people who use it as an academic. I'm inclined to use it at times because I want to kind of frame y'all in a bigger conversation with Frank Cherry, Rabbi Wentworth. I want to frame you in a tradition of the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. I want to frame you in a tradition of, to a lesser extent, Dr. York and or Rabboni Yeshua at the time, and the Nubian Islamic Hebrews, right? An organization to which I have ties, right? So, I in the past, long past, but
I understand.
Yeah, I gotta say that for the people before the Nuwabians be on my head. You know what I mean? They be focused on the wrong things, man.
Right.
but all that to say, who are Hebrew Israelites? How do you define Hebrew Israelite?
I'm glad you mentioned the FS Cherry and stuff like that, because a lot of people think like being an Israelite is something that's kind of fairly new.
Yep.
They don't know, like, Harriet Tubman knew she was an Israelite. You mentioned FS Cherry, Rabbi Wentworth, Ford. The being an Israelite really goes way back. It's almost like the untold history. Like they have Black History Month, and they always discovering new things. They have like Black inventions of this and that. And so when you actually delve into the history of being an Israelite, you'll find out that it actually goes pretty deep. Also, like when you said in the beginning, when you was talking, when you said Black Hebrew Israelite, and then you said Hebrew Israelite, because Black Hebrew Israelite has a acronym called BHI, and that's something that the Israelis came up with to make it derogatory for anybody like us to say we're Israelite. It's like, oh, that's them Black Hebrew Israelites over there. They ain't, like, almost to make it seem like they not the real Israelites. They just the Black,
Black
Hebrew, right? So, and so that's why I was glad that you said it the way that you said. But for us, being a Hebrew Israelite is us really getting back to our identity, our heritage, our culture. One of the things that we feel that Black people suffer from is an identity crisis, which is why we have so many different religious beliefs, religious factions, religious sects. I mean, even you mentioned the Nuwabians, you have Muslims, you have Christians, you have atheists, all these different belief systems that we go into. For us in the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, currently under Commander Jenny Hanna, we teach that our identity starts and stops with the Bible. So we identify with being the children of Israel. And so now that gives us an identity, it gives us a culture, it gives us law, it gives us code of ethics that's uncontrolled by man. Like most, even Christianity is controlled by man. It's like what their doctrine believes. Islam, the same thing. Any other cult has the same thing. When it comes to being an Israelite, the laws is already set. So if we say you can eat this and you can't eat that, it's not what I came up with. We're going to read it in the Bible and say, this is what the Bible says. If we say you can only marry a certain people, we're going to say it says it here. So everything that we live by is already written. So it's not something that Commander Jenny Hanna came up with and said, okay, we're going to do it like this. We can read in the Bible. So it's really about giving us an identity, giving an answer to the age-old question, like who we are. Like if you ask 10 Black people who they are, you're going to get 10 different answers. Some, the Christian, atheist, 5%, Jehovah's Witness, like as if your religion is your identity. But if you ask a white person, even if they started as white, they might say I'm Irish or I'm Italian, and then they can tell you what it means to be Irish. They can tell you what it means to be Italian. We don't really know what it means to be Black. It's going to come to either some music, some sports. It's going to come to a religion, but it's not going to really give us a culture. So being an Israelite, first and foremost, is about giving us an identity that gives us a moral code, moral ethics, a God. That's how we teach it. That's how we push it.
That's actually very helpful. When I think about that long tradition of Black Hebrew Israelites, and I mentioned Rabbi Wentworth, Matthew, I think about the commandment keepers. For those that don't know,
right?
You talk about all the way back in Harlem, over 100 years ago. Again, for y'all to think Hebrew Israelites are a new thing, they're certainly not. Even as an organized, named body, Captain Tazaryach is also talking about a longer tradition. We'll talk about Harriet Tubman and all that stuff,
right?
But even in terms of self-identifying, we got over a century of this tradition. A lot of those people come out of a church, though, right? A lot of them identified as Christians, but as they went through the Hebrew Bible, they said, "Wait, Exodus, that's us."
Yeah,
etc.
Even further, a lot of them learned from Jewish people. because at that time you got us, being in all these different, even historically, there's a what they call a slave Bible. So the slave Bible was when they took out certain verses that they felt would cause a rebellion amongst the slaves. This is what makes a Nat Turner, F.S. Cherry, Denmark Vesey, what make them so historical, because when they got their hands on the actual Bible, it did inspire rebellion. Anybody can look that up. So when it comes to the history of it, a lot of them, like even our founding fathers, Abba Bivens, Ariyah Yaquab, they learned by going into Jewish synagogues. And as they going into the Jewish synagogues, thinking that they're gonna be Jewish for all intents and purposes, or in a Christian church, they're gonna be Christian or they're gonna be Jewish. And then when you start reading the Bible, and then you start looking at what's happening to us, and then you start looking at the Jewish people, and you start looking at the Christian, you say, okay, this don't really line up biblically. The way it's described and the way they look doesn't look like who you're telling me are the people of the book. The prophecies that you're saying are ascribed to these people don't look like it's ascribed to them. And then so the Matthews, the Fords, all these people start leaving out of the Christian church and out of the Jewish synagogues, because they're finding out that the people that are teaching them the Bible, really, we should be teaching them technically, because it's our record. So as they start realizing that they were the people, they start leaving out of those synagogues, they start leaving out of those Christian churches. And then that's when we start establishing and start learning on our own. And of course, as a baby in the infant stage, you're just growing. So you're learning. So at one point, they might not have believed in Jesus. And then as they start learning, then they believe in Jesus. They might not believe in Moses or even have the full understanding of the Bible that they should. But the one thing that those men did know is that they were the people of the book. And so we always look at it spiritually, that the Lord will pour out his spirit upon all flesh and we will prophesy. So that's what you see with the F.S. Cherries, the Wentworths, the Fords, the Abba Bivens, the Ariyahs, the Yaquabs, all the way up to now. And it's really because of the internet. So it's a lot easier for information to spread, as opposed to back then. It was like, if you wasn't like in the New York area or in the Chicago area or something like that, it would be hard to grasp or get this information.
You said a couple of things, and we're going to address some of the comments that come in as they come in when they're useful. We'll take questions as well. But I want to speak to, in particular, one sister who just wrote in and said, Rabbi Matthew was not a Hebrew Israelite. They rejected Jesus and Christianity, practiced Judaism. I think I don't disagree, but I think Rabbi Matthew would say that they were Hebrews and that Ethiopians were of the tribe, among the 12 tribes. But they have initially identified as a church, right? They were, they became the commandment keepers, Ethiopian Hebrew Israelites. But remember, at one point they were. Let me see if I can find it, because I don't want to give it wrong.
Yeah, and I think what people have to understand is that even when Rabbi Matthew and stuff like that, they still were Israelites. Like, right. Whether you say whether they reject Christ or not does not take away from them being an Israelite. Even during the time of Christ, Israelites rejected Christ. So we could read in the Bible that they rejected Christ. They told Caesar, we have no king but Caesar. And those as Israelites rejecting another Israelite. That doesn't take away from the point of them starting out in the Jewish synagogue and then realizing they were the people. So even if they didn't believe in Christ all the way, they did know that the Jewish man was not the Jewish man, was not the Jew. They knew that they was a Jew. And I think that's the most important part of the story, because in the infant stage, you had two different types. I always call it like two different types of Israelites. You had Israelites that started out Christians, and you had Israelites that started out in Judaism. And so as they transition out of Judaism and Christianity, of course, their foundation is going to be learning from that position before they would graduate to another. So we have a lot of Israelites that started out in Judaism and then become what we would call Messianic Jews, for people to understand the terminology.
Which is a very important conversation we're going to have, because I've been in Israel and watched Messianic Jews not be allowed in. And we'll talk about that. I want to talk about this whole idea of what it means to be Jewish in just a second. But you are you're identifying Hebrew Israelite not as a religious faith per
Right.
se,
Right.
but as a national identity and ethnic
Mhm.
identity. Would those be fair labels? Ethnic and
Yes.
national identity?
Yes. It would be ethnic, meaning like you can't, like in religion, anybody can conform to that. So a Hispanic, a Chinese, or Japanese can be Christian. In our belief system, you have to ethnically be an Israelite. So in North, Central, and South America, we would say the Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Indians. And then you got Israelites in Africa, you got Israelites in Europe, you got Israelites in Asia. But if you're not ethnically an Israelite, you can't be an Israelite. That's where our position is from.
Okay. So and please correct me if this isn't right. I just pulled this up, but this looks like the signs that I've seen.
Yes. Yes,
This,
that would be correct. That's the correct sign.
okay. Anybody who has spent time, we're gonna talk about that too. Anybody who spent time in an urban city has probably seen one of the Israelite schools outside teaching. And one of the things that you will often see when you see them outside is a sign. Now, the sign isn't as pretty as this one. I actually think they're much better on the street.
Right.
Because y'all make them, and what I mean, they're very different than the kind you're seeing right here, which is
Right.
more.
But that's more basic, straight to the point where they could just look right at it.
Right. Exactly. And I get that, and I ain't mad at that. But when I see this, when I see the sign, I've always wondered this, and I've never had an opportunity to really ask anybody. They're saying that, again, for those who don't know, there are 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, to be more specific. And you all argue that each of these ethnic groups or national groups are descendants of those different tribes. So American Blacks are the tribe of Judah, which, as an American Negro myself, I'll take it. But then we got the West Indian Blacks are from Benjamin, Haitians from Levi, etc., etc. It's always seemed so neat, those lines,
Right.
and with partly just because of all the mixing that seemed hard for me to believe, but also because of like Dominican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Haitian. I mean, all that is
close.
Yeah. How did you all determine which lineage was which? And I'll be honest with you, because I don't want, this isn't a gotcha. I have heard arguments that some of the early organizational founders said that they made this up.
Right. Yeah, so that's a falsehood, that the person that's from the earlier organization is not actually legit. So the first thing, the 12 tribe chart is a marker. So it's not an absolute, meaning like you have people that might look people that might look Black, and then you find out that they're Native Indian, but they think that they're Black. So it's really just a marker where this is where the dominant people are from each one of these tribes.